In the spring of the year 1429, the walls of Orléans shook under English bombardment. France had been bleeding for nearly a century, its people worn down by endless war, famine, and despair. The Dauphin Charles, heir to a throne that many believed would never be his, hid in uncertainty, unsure whether his cause had already been lost. Then, from the quiet village of Domremy, stepped a teenage peasant girl who claimed she was sent by God to save France. Her name was Joan. She wore no crown, came from no noble house, and held no military rank. Yet within months of arriving at court, she was leading armies into battle, raising banners high, and turning the tide of a war that seemed unwinnable. What gave her such power? Was it her unshakable faith, the charisma of her presence, or the desperation of a nation ready to believe in a miracle? And how did this girl, barely 17 years old, stand before kings and commanders and demand not only to be heard, but to be followed? The story of Joan of Arc is one of the most astonishing in human history. It is a tale of courage and conviction, but also of betrayal, manipulation, and tragedy. Her life forces us to ask questions about belief, leadership, and the thin line between legend and reality. Today, centuries later, she remains one of the most studied and admired figures in history. From battlefield heroine to martyr, from condemned heretic to canonized saint, Joan's journey continues to inspire. But behind the myths and the flames, who was the real Joan of Arc? Welcome to our channel Words of Time. In this video, we dive deep into the life, legacy, and mystery of Joan of Arc, uncovering the truth behind the legend and exploring why her story still matters today. Joan of Arc has long stood as one of the most fascinating figures in world history, not because she lived a long life or left behind written works, but because of how a simple peasant girl transformed the course of a nation's struggle at a decisive moment. Her life was short, lasting only about 19 years, yet the memory of her courage and her dramatic end has continued to inspire for centuries. To understand her, it is important to go past the myths, the paintings, the later religious veneration, and the patriotic stories, and look at what we know about the young woman who came to believe she was sent by God to rescue France. Her story is not only about faith, but also about politics, war, and the resilience of someone who never abandoned what she believed even when the price was her own life. She was born around the year 1412 in the village of Domremy in northeastern France, a small community of farmers. Her family was not wealthy. They were peasants who worked the land, which meant Joan grew up in the rhythms of rural life, helping with animals and learning the basic tasks expected of girls. She could not read or write, something common at the time, especially for those not born into noble families. In the eyes of the world around her, Joan would have seemed destined for an ordinary life. No one could have imagined that she would step onto the stage of history and meet kings, command armies, and eventually face trial for her life. The France into which Joan was born was torn apart by the 100 Years' War, a long and exhausting conflict between England and France that had begun in the early part of the 14th century. By the time Joan was a teenager, French fortunes were at their lowest point. Much of northern France was under English control, and even more land was occupied by the Burgundians, who were French allies of England. The legitimate French heir, Charles, who would later be known as Charles VII, had not been crowned king and was viewed by many as weak and unable to resist his enemies. The war had left deep scars, not only in the battlefield losses, but also in famine, banditry, and despair. For people in villages like Domremy, the war was not an abstract conflict between rulers. It was a daily fear, a force that could sweep through with soldiers, burning homes, and spreading terror. It was into this world that Joan claimed to have received visions and voices from saints, urging her to take up a mission. She later testified that around the age of 13, she began hearing what she described as heavenly voices, which she believed came from Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These voices told her that she had been chosen to save France, to drive out the English, and to see the Dauphin Charles crowned as king in the traditional coronation city of Reims. For a young peasant girl to say such things was extraordinary. It challenged all expectations of her time. Women were not meant to lead armies or to advise kings, and someone from her station in life had no claim to speak in political or military matters. Yet Joan believed with complete conviction, and that conviction gave her a strength that persuaded others to listen. When she first attempted to approach local officials, she was dismissed. A teenage girl claiming divine mission sounded like folly. Yet Joan did not give up. She eventually convinced a local nobleman to support her request to travel to meet Charles, the Dauphin, at his court in Chinon. This was a journey of great risk, since she had to travel across dangerous territories where enemy patrols and bandits were common. Still, she persisted. When she finally stood before Charles, she managed something remarkable. She convinced him to allow her to accompany his forces. Accounts describe how she recognized him in disguise when he tried to test her, and how her determination and clarity of purpose made an impression. Charles was at a moment of desperation. His resources were limited, and his cause seemed to be fading. Allowing Joan a chance may have seemed worth the risk, especially since she claimed the support of God. Joan was given a small contingent and a suit of armor. She carried not a sword as her main symbol, but a banner that bore religious images, which she treated with reverence. Her first and greatest achievement came in the relief of the city of Orléans in 1429. The city had been under siege by the English, and its fall would have been a devastating blow. Joan's arrival brought a new spirit. She inspired soldiers who had been weary and doubtful. While she was not a trained commander in the formal sense, her presence lifted morale, and she pushed for bold action. Within days, the French forces struck with new energy, and the English siege was broken. This victory was not only a military turning point, but also a psychological one. For the first time in years, the French had a reason to believe that their cause was not hopeless. From Orléans, Joan urged Charles to move quickly to Reims for his coronation. This was a symbolic goal, because Reims was the traditional site where French kings were crowned, and without that ceremony, Charles's claim lacked legitimacy in the eyes of many. Joan's insistence proved correct. The march to Reims was daring, cutting through territory that was not fully secure, but town after town opened its gates, inspired by her reputation and the momentum that followed Orléans. In July of 1429, Charles was crowned as Charles VII in Reims, with Joan standing nearby, her banner raised. For her, this was the fulfillment of a central part of her mission, and it cemented her role as more than a symbolic figure. She was a national heroine, yet her story did not end in triumph. War is never straightforward, and despite the victories, the French cause was still fragile. Joan continued to push for further action, urging campaigns to press the advantage, but political leaders were cautious. Charles himself seemed less eager to take risks once he had been crowned. Joan led further operations, including attempts to liberate Paris, but not all ended in success. In 1430, during a campaign near Compiègne, she was captured by Burgundian forces. Her capture was a disaster for her cause, and Charles made little effort to secure her release. The Burgundians sold her to the English, who saw her as both a dangerous enemy and an opportunity. The English and their allies put Joan on trial, not as a soldier but as a heretic. The court was composed of clerics sympathetic to English interests. The charges focused on her visions, her claim of divine guidance, and even her choice to wear male clothing, which was considered scandalous and a violation of church rules. The trial records show her intelligence and quick wit. Despite being uneducated, she answered questions with clarity and often turned the arguments of her judges back on them. Her belief never wavered, and she continued to claim that her voices had guided her mission. The trial was less about justice and more about political theater. By condemning her as a heretic, the English hoped to undermine Charles's legitimacy, since he owed his coronation in part to her support. After months of questioning and pressure, Joan was declared guilty and sentenced to death. In May of 1431, she was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She was 19 years old. Witnesses described how she faced her death with courage, asking for a cross to be held before her as the flames rose. Her final words were said to be prayers to Jesus. For those who saw her die, the event was shocking. Even some who had condemned her felt that an injustice had been done. The attempt to erase her as a heretic failed, because her story only grew in power. 25 years later, a new trial was held by order of the Pope, and she was declared innocent and a martyr. Centuries later, in 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. The story of Joan of Arc is not just about one person's courage, but also about how history and myth intertwine. On one hand, she was clearly a young woman of extraordinary conviction, able to inspire soldiers, confront powerful men, and stay true to her beliefs even under threat of death. On the other hand, much of what is remembered about her has been shaped by later generations. Artists painted her as a shining figure in armor, writers told stories that emphasized miracles, and nations used her as a symbol. For the French, she became a patriotic icon, especially in times of war or crisis. For the Church, she became an example of saintly devotion. For others, she was a symbol of female courage in a male-dominated world. Each interpretation adds layers, sometimes making it difficult to see the person behind them. If we try to look beyond the legends, what we see is a teenager who believed completely in her mission, who stood firm even when surrounded by doubt and danger. Her military role was real, but it was as much about morale as about tactics. She may not have planned battles in detail, but she gave soldiers the confidence to fight. Her religious visions can be understood in different ways. Some see them as genuine mystical experiences, others as psychological responses to the stress of her time, and others as a combination of both. Whatever their source, they gave her strength, and they allowed her to face even the most powerful judges without fear. Her life also raises questions about how individuals can change the course of events. The 100 Years' War was a long and complex conflict with many causes and many players. Yet the arrival of Joan at a critical moment did shift the balance. Without her, it is possible that Charles might not have been crowned when he was, and French resistance might have collapsed. One person, against all odds, changed the direction of history, not through wealth or birth, but through faith and determination. In remembering Joan of Arc, it is also important to see the human side. She was not a myth in her own eyes. She was a girl who left her village, who must have felt fear on the battlefield, who endured imprisonment and interrogation, and who met her death in fire. She lived in a world of suffering and violence, yet she never gave up the hope that God had chosen her for a purpose. Whether one shares her faith or not, her courage remains undeniable. Her story has lasted because it speaks to universal themes. It is about the power of conviction, the struggle of the weak against the strong, and the ability of an ordinary person to stand up when others fall silent. It is about how history often underestimates those on the margins, only to be surprised when they step forward and change everything. And it is about how even in defeat, even in death, a voice can echo across centuries. Joan of Arc lived less than 2 decades, but in that brief span, she moved from an unknown village girl to a figure known throughout the world. She continues to be remembered not only as a saint and a heroine, but as a reminder of what human courage can achieve when guided by unshakable belief. Beyond the myths and the legends, she was a person who dared to believe that she could change her country's fate, and she did. Joan of Arc's rise from obscurity has often been told in simple terms. A poor and uneducated peasant girl who heard divine voices and stepped forward when her nation was broken. Yet when we look closer, the story becomes richer and more complex. To say she was nothing more than an illiterate village girl misses the nuances of her environment and the particular moment of history into which she was born. Her upbringing in Domremy was indeed rural, but she did not grow up in total ignorance. She lived in a village that was part of the shifting frontier between French loyalists and Burgundian sympathizers, a place where political tension was always near. Although she could not read or write, she was shaped by the constant presence of religion, by the stories of saints, and by the rituals of the church that marked the life of every villager. Her family was not wealthy, but they were not the poorest either. They owned land and animals, and her father Jacques d'Arc was a respected man in the community. Joan grew up with a sense of duty, responsibility, and faith that was deepened by the instability surrounding her. It is worth remembering that illiteracy in the 15th century did not necessarily mean ignorance. Oral tradition was strong, sermons were frequent, and stories of biblical heroes and local saints circulated widely. Joan may not have written words on a page, but she had absorbed the language of faith and prophecy from childhood. She knew how to speak with conviction and how to frame her mission in terms that her audience could understand. When she later faced interrogation by scholars and clerics, she showed a quick mind, answering questions with precision and sometimes with clever defiance. This suggests that while she lacked formal schooling, she had developed intelligence and presence through experience, through listening, and through the moral education of her community. Her visions, too, must be understood in the context of her time. The 15th century was an age when belief in divine intervention was woven into daily life. Saints were not distant figures, they were intercessors who could appear, guide, and protect. Visions and prophecies were not automatically dismissed as madness. Instead, they could be powerful claims, especially when they resonated with collective hopes. France at this moment was desperate for signs of divine favor. The The long war with England had drained resources and morale. Many believed that God's judgment was against France because of corruption, divisions, and the failure of its leaders. In such a climate, the idea that a humble girl might be chosen by heaven to deliver salvation was not impossible. It was compelling. When Joan spoke of Saint Michael the Archangel, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret guiding her, she was invoking figures deeply revered in medieval devotion. Saint Michael represented victory against evil and was honored as a protector of France. Saint Catherine was known for her wisdom in debates with pagan scholars and for her martyrdom. Saint Margaret was a symbol of courage and purity. Together, these figures gave Joan's testimony weight and meaning in the minds of those who heard her. They were not random names but carefully significant saints embodying strength, wisdom, and endurance. Whether Joan consciously selected them or truly experienced their voices, the effect was the same. Her claim carried spiritual authority. Skeptics might ask whether Joan's visions were genuine spiritual experiences or shaped by her imagination and environment. Historians have debated this for centuries. Some argue that her voices could have been symptoms of illness or psychological strain. Others believe she genuinely encountered divine revelation. But what matters most for understanding her rise is not whether her visions were real in an objective sense, but how they were received. To the people of France, weary from defeat and longing for deliverance, Joan's certainty offered hope. Her conviction was more persuasive than any theological argument. For Charles, the Dauphin who would become Charles VII, her arrival could not have been more timely. By the year 1429, his situation was dire. He had not yet been crowned, and his legitimacy was questioned. Large parts of his kingdom were controlled by the English and their Burgundian allies. His treasury was nearly empty, his armies demoralized, and his advisors divided. He was surrounded by a sense of failure. Rumors even suggested that he was not the true heir, a doubt that gnawed at his claim. In such a climate of despair, the bold assurance of a young girl who said that heaven itself had chosen him must have struck a deep chord. It is important to see that Charles was not naive. He did not simply hand his fate to the first visionary who appeared. Before giving Joan support, he had her examined by churchmen and nobles. They questioned her about her faith, her visions, and her intentions. They even tested her with tricks, such as disguising Charles among his courtiers to see if she could recognize him. When she singled him out, he must have been startled, whether or not he believed it was by divine insight. For a leader with few options left, Joan represented a chance, and in war, sometimes a chance is enough. Once she was given her banner, armor, and a small company, Joan entered the military sphere, something unthinkable for a woman of her background. Yet she did not claim to be a general in the traditional sense. Her role was spiritual and symbolic as much as tactical. She brought energy, morale, and an unshakable confidence that emboldened soldiers. At Orléans, the turning point of her career, her courage in riding among the troops, her prayers, and her insistence on pressing forward transformed what might have been another siege of attrition into a dramatic victory. Whether or not she made detailed strategic decisions, her presence was decisive. Soldiers who had been reluctant now believed that God was with them, and belief can be the difference between defeat and victory. Joan's success forced people to reconsider what a peasant girl could be. She had crossed the boundaries of gender, class, and expectation. She spoke with nobles, directed soldiers, and advised the Dauphin. She challenged the idea that power belonged only to men of noble birth or clerical learning. Yet she never presented herself as a rival to them. She always framed her mission as obedience to God. This humility, combined with confidence, made her both radical and acceptable. She could step into roles forbidden to her, but she did so as a servant of heaven, not as a self-promoter. That balance was crucial. Her relationship with Charles remained complicated. She gave him legitimacy through the coronation at Reims, but he often hesitated to follow her urgings afterward. She wanted to press the war with greater energy, to expel the English entirely, but Charles and his advisors were more cautious, concerned about political negotiations and the limits of their resources. Joan's vision was absolute, theirs was pragmatic. This tension would shape her later struggles, and eventually her downfall. Looking back, the extraordinary rise of Joan of Arc can be understood as the convergence of personal faith, political desperation, and cultural expectation. Without her voices, she might have remained an anonymous village girl. Without the broken state of France, her voices would never have found an audience. Without the Dauphin's weakness, she would never have been admitted to his court. Each piece was necessary for the miracle of her ascent. What makes her story so enduring is not only the victories she inspired, but the way she embodied the hopes of a nation. She was not a commander in the technical sense, yet she became the heart of a movement. She was not a scholar, yet she outwitted theologians in trial. She was not of noble blood, yet she stood beside a king at his coronation. And she was not a soldier trained for war, yet she led armies into battle. Her life was a contradiction, and it is in that contradiction that her power lies. As we think about the girl from Domremy who became the Maid of Orleans, we see not a mythic figure carved in stone, but a human being who believed completely in her mission. That belief spread outward, transforming others, until an entire kingdom found new strength. Her path was not smooth. Her triumphs led quickly to capture, trial, and death. Yet even in defeat, she could not be silenced. Her ashes scattered in the wind became seeds of legend. Her ascent was unlikely, but not accidental. It was the product of faith meeting history, of conviction meeting desperation, and of one voice that refused to be ignored. From peasant girl to prophecy, Joan of Arc became more than a figure of her time. She became a symbol for all time, showing how the most unexpected person can stand at the turning point of history. When Joan of Arc arrived at Orléans in the spring of 1429, the war had reached one of its most desperate stages for the French. The city had been under siege since the previous October, cut off by a ring of English fortifications and garrisons. If it fell, the English would hold a vital crossing of the Loire River and open the road toward the very heart of France. For months, French attempts to relieve the city had failed, and the defenders inside were worn down by hunger, shortages, and the despair that comes when rescue seems unlikely. The appearance of Joan, a teenage girl in armor claiming she was sent by God, might easily have been dismissed as folly. Yet what happened in the days that followed changed the trajectory of the entire war. To say that Joan's leadership was only about charisma would be to overlook the strategic sharpness she displayed. She did not design elaborate military maneuvers on parchment, but she had a keen sense of momentum and the importance of acting boldly when hesitation meant certain defeat. French commanders before her had been reluctant to commit to decisive attacks on the English fortifications. They had preferred skirmishes and half-hearted efforts that avoided the risk of a full assault. Joan, by contrast, urged direct action. She believed that God had promised victory if they trusted and fought with courage, and she carried this message constantly to the soldiers. On May 4th, the French attacked one of the English outposts, and Joan, though not wielding tactical maps, pushed them forward with unrelenting energy. Over the next days, more positions fell. The critical battle came on May 7th, when the French launched an assault on the Tourelles, the main English stronghold guarding the bridge into Orléans. The fight was brutal, with arrows, cannon, and desperate hand-to-hand combat. Joan was struck by an arrow in the shoulder, yet after being treated briefly, she returned to the front lines, holding her banner high and calling on the soldiers to keep pressing. Her very presence, bleeding but unbroken, ignited the French into one final surge. By evening, the Tourelles was taken, and the English were forced to withdraw. This was more than a military victory. It was the first major French triumph in years, and it carried a symbolic weight far greater than the battlefield itself. The English had long been regarded as nearly invincible, their disciplined longbowmen and commanders dominating campaign after campaign. To see them driven back, and to see it happen under the inspiration of a young woman who claimed divine mission, convinced many that the tide of the war had truly shifted. Orléans was not just relieved, it became a rallying cry, a sign that God's favor had returned to France. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Armies do not fight only with weapons but with belief. For years, French soldiers had fought with doubt in their hearts, fearing that their cause was cursed. Joan changed that atmosphere almost overnight. She was not only their leader, she was their living proof that heaven was on their side. Her banner, embroidered with holy images, became the center of their formation, a visible reminder that the battle was not just of men but of God. Soldiers who had been reluctant to attack before now charged with confidence. Her courage gave them courage, and courage multiplied gave them victory. This transformation of morale extended beyond the battlefield. Word of Orléans spread quickly through towns and villages. Peasants, townsfolk, and clergy began to speak of the maid who had saved the city. In a country exhausted by war, hunger, and division, hope had returned. Hope is a force as real as steel and gunpowder in war. It fills the ranks, it strengthens resolve, and it draws allies where once there was only indifference. Joan's presence had lit a fire in the collective heart of France, and from that moment forward, she was not merely a soldier's companion. She was the embodiment of national revival. Joan did not stop at Orléans. She pressed Charles to seize the moment. In her eyes, the victory was a sign that God had opened the path for his coronation. Reims, the traditional site where French kings were anointed, lay deep in territory still controlled by enemies, but Joan insisted that the army march there regardless. For Charles, the idea seemed risky. His advisors hesitated, weighing the dangers. Yet Joan's certainty proved stronger than caution. She declared that God's will was clear. The Dauphin must be crowned to claim his rightful throne. The march to Reims was itself a display of her growing influence. As the French army moved north, towns that might have resisted instead opened their gates. Some were persuaded by the momentum of recent victories, others by fear of standing against a movement that seemed blessed, and still others by genuine devotion to Joan's cause. Whatever their reasons, the effect was the same. The road to Reims cleared without the costly battles that might have been expected. On July 17, 1429, Charles was crowned in the great cathedral of Reims. Joan stood at his side, her banner displayed beside the royal standard. To the watching crowds, this moment was more than ceremony. It was the culmination of prophecy. For years, doubts had plagued Charles's claim. Some had whispered that he was illegitimate, others that he lacked the strength to rule. But here he was, crowned and anointed with holy oil, with the Maid of Orleans at his side, the very figure who had declared this would happen. His reign was no longer just a contested inheritance. It had been sealed in the eyes of God and the people. For Joan, the coronation was the fulfillment of her central mission. Her voices had told her to see Charles crowned, and she had done it. Yet in achieving this, she also reached the height of her influence. In the weeks that followed, her voice still carried weight, but political realities began to reassert themselves. Charles, now secure in his legitimacy, grew more cautious. He was content to consolidate rather than pursue the bold campaigns Joan urged. She wanted to drive the English entirely from France. He wanted to protect his crown and negotiate where possible. Their visions diverged, and with that divergence, the unity of purpose that had carried them to Reims began to strain. Still, the significance of those months cannot be understated. Before Joan, France had been fractured, demoralized, and on the brink of collapse. After Orléans and Reims, it was reborn with a sense of destiny. Joan had shifted not only battles, but the very spirit of a nation. She had shown that faith could be stronger than fear, and that a cause once written off as hopeless could blaze again with purpose. The English, too, felt the shift. They recognized that the Maid had become more than a battlefield opponent. She was a symbol, and symbols are dangerous. Defeating her became as much a political necessity as a military one. They could not allow her to stand as the chosen of God who had crowned the French king. To undermine her was to undermine Charles himself. That understanding would shape the next chapters of her life, leading to her capture, trial, and martyrdom. In the end, Orléans was not simply a city saved. It was the turning point where a young girl from Domremy became the axis on which history turned. The coronation at Reims was not simply a royal ritual. It was the moment when prophecy touched politics, and the improbable became reality. Joan's brilliance was not measured in detailed strategy, but in her grasp of the deeper forces at play. The morale of armies, the faith of people, the legitimacy of kings. She knew, perhaps instinctively, that war is not won only with swords but with belief, and she gave France belief at the moment it needed it most. Her journey from Orléans to Reims stands as proof that sometimes history does not move by the plans of generals or the calculations of ministers, but by the conviction of one voice that will not yield. Joan of Arc was that voice. In lifting the siege, in reviving the heart of her people, and in placing the crown on Charles's head, she turned the tide of the 100 Years' War and left a mark that no defeat, no trial, no execution could erase. The triumph of Reims, though monumental, was not the end of Joan's struggle, but the beginning of her decline. Victory had crowned Charles, but the war was far from over. The English still held significant strongholds, and their Burgundian allies remained powerful. Joan, filled with conviction, pressed for new campaigns to drive the enemy further back, but Charles and his advisors grew hesitant. Politics, diplomacy, and fatigue pulled them toward caution, while Joan's visions urged relentless advance. This divergence left her exposed, for while she had the favor of soldiers and the common people, Her position depended on royal support, and that support was never unconditional. In the spring of 1430, Joan led an effort to defend Compiègne, a city under threat from Burgundian forces. She entered the city with a small band of troops and took part in a sortie against the besiegers. The fight was fierce, and as the French attempted to retreat back into the gates, Joan remained outside, covering the withdrawal. In the chaos, the drawbridge was raised too soon, cutting her off. Surrounded, she fought bravely but was dragged from her horse and captured by the Burgundians. This moment sealed her fate. For all her victories, Joan was still a young woman in a man's war, and capture meant no honorable prisoners' exchange, no quick ransom, but something far darker. The Burgundians, long enemies of the Armagnac faction loyal to Charles, viewed Joan as a dangerous symbol. Yet they also understood her value. The English, enraged by their defeats and desperate to discredit Charles's coronation, wanted her in their hands. To destroy Joan was to weaken the legitimacy she had given to the French king. And so, after months of negotiation, the Burgundians sold her to the English for a large sum of money. The transaction was cold and political, stripping away any illusion that she might be rescued quickly. Charles, whose crown she had secured, made little effort to ransom her. His silence has puzzled historians for centuries. Perhaps he feared provoking the English, perhaps he doubted her continued usefulness, or perhaps court politics steered him toward passivity. Whatever the reason, Joan was left alone in the hands of her enemies. The English transferred her to Rouen, their administrative capital in occupied France, where she was placed under heavy guard. Her imprisonment was harsh. Unlike noble prisoners who might be kept in relative comfort, Joan was held in a secular prison, chained and watched by male guards, a violation of the standards that usually applied to accused heretics. The decision was deliberate. The English did not want her treated as a prisoner of war, but as a criminal and a heretic. Her trial was arranged not by military commanders, but by church officials aligned with English interests. The presiding judge was Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a staunch supporter of the English cause. From the beginning, the trial was less about determining truth than about constructing a verdict that would condemn Joan and, by extension, tarnish Charles VII. If she were declared a heretic, then the king she had helped to crown could be painted as illegitimate, raised up by false prophecy. The trial, therefore, was political theater disguised as ecclesiastical inquiry. Over the course of months, Joan was subjected to endless questioning. The clerics sought to trap her with contradictions, to twist her words into blasphemy or disobedience to the church. They pressed her on her visions, demanding to know why she trusted them, how she could be sure they came from God, and why she refused to submit them to the judgment of the church. Joan, though uneducated, proved astonishingly quick in her replies. She often turned questions back on her interrogators or responded with profound simplicity that left them without room to maneuver. When asked if she was in God's grace, a dangerous question since to claim certainty was considered heretical, she answered, "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God keep me there." Such replies showed a clarity that no training could have given her. The charges against her were many, but they centered on three main points: her claim of divine visions, her defiance of church authority, and her wearing of male clothing. The first charge struck at the heart of her mission, for if her voices were judged false or demonic, then all she had done was tainted. The second attacked her independence, since by saying she would answer to God rather than the church, she challenged the structure of clerical authority. The third might seem trivial today, but at the time, wearing men's clothing was considered a serious violation of biblical teaching. Joan had worn armor and men's dress throughout her campaigns, both for practicality in war and for protection in prison, where male clothing gave her some safeguard against assault. Yet her judges seized on it as a visible sign of disobedience, something easy to point to as sin. The trial was grueling, not only intellectually, but psychologically. Joan was isolated, kept under guard, and denied the normal support a prisoner might receive. She faced a court entirely hostile to her, men determined to break her spirit. She was threatened repeatedly with torture, though records suggest it was never carried out. The threat itself, combined with the fatigue of endless interrogation, was a weapon of its own. She was a 19-year-old girl against trained theologians and powerful churchmen, and yet she held her ground for months, refusing to deny her voices or to confess to falsehoods. In May of 1431, after weeks of pressure, Joan finally wavered. Exhausted and fearful of execution, she signed a document of abjuration, recanting her claims and agreeing to submit to the authority of the Church. This recantation has often been cited as weakness, but in truth it reveals the immense pressure she endured. She was shown the instruments of torture, told that she would be burned, and left to imagine the horror of such a death. Any human being in her place might have broken. Yet even this moment was not the end. The English had not truly sought repentance. They had sought her destruction. Within days of her recantation, the situation shifted again. Joan resumed wearing male clothing in prison, claiming it was safer and that her guards left her no choice. This act was treated as a relapse into heresy, providing the excuse her judges needed. Whether she intended it or not, by returning to the clothing that had always protected her, she sealed her fate. The court declared her a relapsed heretic, and for that, the penalty was death. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was led to the marketplace of Rouen. She was dressed in a simple gown, her head shaved, and she was tied to a tall wooden stake surrounded by bundles of wood. Witnesses described her as calm, though trembling with human fear. She asked for a cross, and a sympathetic soldier fashioned one from sticks and handed it to her. She prayed as the fire was lit, calling on Jesus until the flames silenced her voice. When it was over, the executioners scattered her ashes into the Seine, determined that no relic of her body would remain to inspire devotion. The trial had been a farce, designed not to uncover truth, but to enforce a verdict predetermined by politics. The English and their allies believed that by burning Joan, they had destroyed her. Yet in time, the opposite proved true. The spectacle of her courage in the face of death, the injustice of the proceedings, and the silence of Charles in her defense all magnified her legend. She became not a discredited heretic, but a martyr. Decades later, when political tides had shifted, Charles himself requested a new trial. The Church re-examined the case, interviewing witnesses and studying the original records. In 1456, Joan was declared innocent, her earlier condemnation nullified. She was proclaimed a victim of prejudice and political manipulation. Nearly 5 centuries after her death, in the year 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. Her trial remains one of the most striking examples of how power can twist justice, how fear can force recantation, and how conviction can still shine through betrayal. Joan stood before the greatest authorities of her age, denied friends, denied advocates, denied freedom, and yet she spoke with clarity that continues to resonate. Even in her temporary recantation, we see not weakness but humanity. She was 19, terrified and alone. That she recanted for a brief moment is not shameful. It is evidence that she was flesh and blood, not a myth. That she returned to her convictions, knowing it meant death, is what made her extraordinary. Joan of Arc's capture and trial revealed the very forces she had defied throughout her short life. The politics of powerful men, the rigidity of institutions, and the cruelty of war. Yet even in defeat, her voice triumphed. She was burned in Rouen, but her memory outlived her captors. The Burgundians sold her, the English condemned her, the Church betrayed her, and Charles abandoned her, but none of them succeeded in erasing her. Her trial by fire became the crucible in which her legend was forged, a legend that has never faded. When the flames consumed Joan of Arc in Rouen on that May morning of 1431, those who ordered her death believed they were erasing a dangerous figure from history. They wanted her gone, her reputation blackened, her name forgotten or remembered only as a warning. But fire often purifies as much as it destroys, and in Joan's case, it transformed her from a captured rebel into a martyr whose story has never ceased to grow. The ashes that were scattered into the river were meant to erase her completely, yet instead, they spread her image far beyond the walls of Rouen and beyond the reach of her enemies. In death, she became larger than she had ever been in life. The spectacle of her execution was not the end, but the beginning of her legend. Witnesses were moved by her courage, by her insistence to the end that her mission had been from God, and by the serenity with which she faced the flames. Some described how even hardened soldiers wept at the sight, how her final prayers echoed through the crowd. For many, her death could not be reconciled with the charges against her. If she had been a witch or heretic, why did she die with Christ's name on her lips? If she had been an enemy of the faith, why did her faith seem so strong in her final hour? The doubts began immediately, and with them, the seeds of martyrdom took root. Over the years that followed, stories of Joan's life and death circulated widely. To the English, she remained a figure of scorn. Their propaganda had painted her as a witch, a tool of the devil who had tricked the French into false victories. They could not afford to let her memory inspire rebellion, so they continued to speak of her as a criminal whose punishment was justified. But propaganda has limits, and memories of injustice are hard to suppress. In France, Joan was remembered very differently. Soldiers who had fought with her told stories of her courage. Villagers repeated tales of the maid who had lifted their spirits and brought hope. Priests spoke of her as a figure who had been condemned unjustly, a servant of God wrongly killed by men more concerned with politics than truth. The contrast between the English portrayal and the French memory created the tension that would eventually transform her from condemned heretic to beloved martyr. This transformation was not immediate. For decades after her death, France remained divided and uncertain. Charles VII, though crowned, did little to defend Joan's memory while she was alive, but the legitimacy she had given him could not be erased. As he secured his reign and the English power in France weakened, the memory of Joan became more valuable. By the middle of the 15th century, voices began calling for her rehabilitation. Finally, in 1456, 25 years after her execution, a retrial was ordered by Pope Calixtus III at the request of Charles and Joan's family. Witnesses from her trial, villagers from Domremy, and soldiers who had served with her gave testimony. The retrial revealed the prejudices, the coercion, and the political motives that had tainted the original proceedings. The court overturned the earlier verdict, declaring Joan innocent and describing her as a victim of corruption and injustice. In that moment, she was no longer a heretic, but a martyr officially recognized by the Church. Her rehabilitation gave new life to her story, and with each century that followed, her reputation grew. Writers, poets, and chroniclers celebrated her as the savior of France. She was remembered in ballads, depicted in artwork, and invoked in sermons. She became not only a national heroine, but also a spiritual symbol, a reminder that God could raise the humble to confound the mighty. Her life showed that faith and courage could overturn the expectations of society, that a girl from a village could inspire armies and change the fate of kingdoms. Still, her canonization as a saint took centuries. Part of the delay came from the complexity of her legacy. She was both political and spiritual, both soldier and visionary, and the Church was cautious about elevating someone whose story was so tied to war and national identity. Yet devotion to her never faded. Pilgrims visited the places she had lived and fought. People prayed to her for courage in times of hardship. Her memory became especially powerful during moments of crisis, when France once again faced invasion or internal division. By the 19th century, Joan's image had become central to the French sense of identity. After the turmoil of the French Revolution and the rise and fall of Napoleon, France sought symbols of unity. Joan provided that symbol. She was pure, patriotic, and deeply French. She belonged to no political party, but to the nation itself. Artists painted her in shining armor, banners flying, eyes lifted to heaven. Writers retold her story in plays and novels, some emphasizing her piety, others her nationalism. She was invoked by both monarchists and republicans, by Catholics and secular patriots alike. Her ability to bridge divides made her a uniquely powerful figure in the 19th century imagination. It was in this climate that the movement for her canonization gained momentum. After long investigation, Pope Benedict XV officially canonized her in 1920. The ceremony drew immense crowds, and Joan was finally recognized as Saint Joan of Arc. Her sainthood was not only a religious honor, but also a statement about her role in history. The Church that had once condemned her now celebrated her as a holy martyr, vindicated in faith and in memory. The shift from witch to saint, from condemned heretic to national heroine, is one of the most striking transformations in history. Few figures have undergone such a reversal. The very accusations used to destroy her, her visions, her defiance, her refusal to conform, became the qualities celebrated in her sainthood. Her trial, once meant to erase her, became the record that preserved her voice, because the transcripts of her testimony survive and allow us to hear her words centuries later. What was meant as evidence of guilt has become evidence of courage. Joan's influence has extended far beyond France. She has become a universal symbol of resistance, conviction, and the power of belief. In the 19th and 20th centuries, suffragettes fighting for women's rights often invoked her image. They saw in her the proof that women could lead, could inspire, could change history. Banners at rallies depicted her on horseback, sword raised, a reminder that courage was not confined to men. To women seeking the vote, Joan was not just a saint, but a sister across the centuries, someone who had broken through barriers long before their time. Her story has also been embraced by political leaders and movements of many kinds. In times of war, her image has been used to rally armies and inspire resistance. During both World Wars, French soldiers marched under her name, and she was presented as the spirit of the nation refusing to yield to foreign domination. In occupied France during the Second World War, both the Free French and the Vichy regime claimed her as their own, a testament to the flexibility of her symbolism. She has been a figure for monarchists, Republicans, nationalists, and feminists alike, her story powerful enough to be interpreted in many ways without losing its force. Beyond politics, Joan has inspired countless works of art. Plays by Shakespeare, Schiller, and Shaw have dramatized her life. Operas, novels, and films have retold her story in new languages and new forms. Painters from the Renaissance to the modern age have depicted her visions, her battles, and her death. In every generation, artists find in Joan something that speaks to their moment. The purity of faith, the tragedy of injustice, the defiance of the weak against the strong. What gives her story such enduring appeal is its combination of the human and the transcendent. She was a young girl, barely out of childhood, who faced challenges that would have broken most seasoned adults. She was illiterate, yet she spoke with wisdom. She was fragile in body, yet she rode into battle. She was condemned, yet she never betrayed her convictions. At the same time, she was more than an individual. She became the vessel for a nation's hopes, the instrument of its revival, and the symbol of its unity. In her, people saw both the vulnerability of humanity and the strength of divine purpose. Even today, Joan's story continues to resonate. In a world often skeptical of visions and miracles, her life still sparks debates. Were her voices real divine messengers, or the product of her imagination shaped by the religious culture of her time? Was she a military genius, or simply an inspired symbol who lifted others to greatness? Historians may argue, but her impact is undeniable. Without her, Charles VII may never have been crowned, and the course of the 100 Years' War might have been very different. Without her, France may not have found the courage to resist at its lowest point. Her martyrdom ensures that her story is not just history but legend. The flames that consumed her body left no relics, yet her words, her courage, and her image have endured as relics more powerful than bones. She remains an enigma, both saint and soldier, visionary and realist, peasant and prophet. Each age finds in her the qualities it needs most, and in that sense, she is not fixed in the 15th century, but alive in every century since. Joan of Arc was 19 years old when she died. In less than a decade, she rose from an obscure village to the courts of kings, led armies, lifted a siege, crowned a monarch, was captured, tried, condemned, and executed. Few lives have been so short, yet so filled with events that changed the destiny of nations. Her legacy is not just in the victories she inspired or the crown she helped secure, but in the way she has continued to inspire across time. She shows that conviction can outlast defeat, that faith can outshine fire, and that the voice of one can echo louder than the decrees of many. From the stake at Rouen to the altar of sainthood, from the pages of propaganda to the banners of protesters, from the battlefields of the 15th century to the movements of the 20th, Joan of Arc has remained one of history's most enduring figures. Her execution was meant to silence her, yet it ensured that her voice would never be forgotten. In that paradox lies the true measure of her legacy. Born in obscurity, killed in flames, remembered forever. In the centuries that followed her canonization and her rise as a symbol of faith and nation, Joan of Arc never truly faded from memory. Instead, each new era revisited her story, polishing it with the concerns, ideals, and imaginations of its own time. By the dawn of the 21st century, Joan stood as one of the rare figures who bridged medieval legend and modern reality. Her image could be found in churches and national monuments, in paintings and operas, in school textbooks and protest banners. Yet the world of today, with its tools of historical analysis, media saturation, and cultural plurality, has begun to see her in new ways, uncovering fresh layers of meaning and questioning long-held assumptions. The modern study of Joan has been enriched by methods unavailable to earlier generations. Where earlier chroniclers relied mainly on the trial transcripts, chronicles, and literary accounts, scholars of the present have a far wider set of tools. Historians working in the 20th and 21st centuries have scoured the archives of France and England, piecing together letters, financial records, and battlefield reports that shed light on the true extent of her role. Archaeologists have surveyed battle sites like Orléans, Reims, and Compiègne, comparing material evidence with written testimony. In some cases, findings confirm her presence and her impact. For instance, weapon fragments, fortification remains, and troop placements align with the descriptions of the siege she helped lift. In other cases, evidence complicates the simple heroic narrative, showing that victories attributed to her also depended on experienced commanders, local militias, and shifting alliances. This tension between myth and fact is one of the central challenges in understanding Joan today. She is both a real historical figure, recorded in legal documents and eyewitness accounts, and a larger-than-life heroine who has been remade in poetry, art, and drama. Modern analysis seeks to distinguish what Joan truly did from what has been added to her story across the centuries. For example, while legends often depict her as leading every charge and wielding a sword with unmatched skill, most contemporary evidence suggests she rarely fought directly. Instead, her leadership was expressed through presence, faith, and the power of example. She carried a banner more often than a blade, and she was most often at the front not to strike but to rally. That distinction does not diminish her greatness, it clarifies it. Her genius was not brute force, but the ability to change the spirit of an army through conviction. Psychological and medical scholars in the 21st century have also revisited the question of her voices. Were they hallucinations, symptoms of an illness, or genuine spiritual experiences? Modern psychiatry has suggested possibilities such as temporal lobe epilepsy or auditory hallucinations caused by stress. Yet such diagnoses, while interesting, cannot be proven and often feel too narrow. Many historians caution against reducing Joan's experiences to medical explanations alone. Her voices, whatever their nature, must be understood in the cultural and religious context of 15th-century France, where visions and divine messages were part of a shared worldview. In a society shaped by war, plague, and intense piety, Joan's voices were believable not only to her, but to those around her. Thus, the debate about whether her voices were supernatural or psychological tells us less about Joan herself than about the lenses through which each generation chooses to interpret her. The sheer volume of research over the past 100 years has produced a far more nuanced picture. We know more about her childhood in Domremy, about the economic struggles of her peasant family, and about the local feuds between French loyalists and Burgundian sympathizers that formed the background of her youth. We know more about the strategies employed at Orléans, about the politics of Charles VII's court, and about the intricate maneuvers of her enemies in Burgundy and England. These details do not demystify Joan so much as they anchor her in her time, showing how extraordinary it was for someone of her background to rise in such a world. At the same time, popular culture in the modern era has carried her story to audiences who may never read a historical monograph. Film and television in particular have given Joan new faces and voices, reshaping her image with each adaptation. Early cinematic portrayals, such as Carl Theodor Dreyer's silent masterpiece, The Passion of Joan of Arc, in 1928, emphasized her martyrdom through stark close-ups and spiritual intensity. Later films, like those of the mid-20th century, often highlighted her nationalism, making her a figure of patriotic inspiration. In the 1990s, productions such as Luc Besson's The Messenger presented her with modern psychological complexity, questioning whether her visions were divine or delusional. The streaming age of the 21st century has brought even more varied depictions. Some recent series focus on historical authenticity, attempting to recreate the world of 15th-century France with detailed sets and costumes while exploring the politics of the 100 Years' War. Others take more creative liberties, placing Joan in allegorical or even fantastical settings, using her story as a metaphor for broader struggles of identity, gender, or resistance. Each portrayal adds to the mosaic of her image, but also risks blurring fact and fiction. For many viewers, the Joan they know best is the one they saw on screen, and that version may say more about contemporary values than about the woman herself. Yet it is precisely this adaptability that keeps Joan relevant. She speaks to different audiences in different ways because her story touches themes that never lose their urgency: faith, courage, injustice, sacrifice, and the defiance of the powerless against the powerful. In a world that still wrestles with questions of gender equality, national identity, and moral conviction, Joan remains a figure who challenges assumptions. The fact that she was a teenager, that she was a woman in a man's world, that she was poor in a society of nobles, and that she stood firm against overwhelming forces. All of this resonates with people who seek inspiration in their own battles. The globalized world of today has also expanded Joan's reach beyond France and Europe. In North America, she has long been admired as a symbol of freedom and individual conscience. In Latin America, she has been invoked by Catholic communities as a model of youthful holiness and social justice. In Asia, she has appeared in manga, anime, and even video games, sometimes as a faithful recreation, sometimes as a wholly reimagined character, but always retaining her core of courage and conviction. Her universality lies not in uniformity, but in the fact that she can be reinterpreted while still recognizable. In the 21st century, new forms of media have allowed her to be rediscovered by younger generations. Social media platforms circulate artwork, quotes, and memes that present her as a feminist icon or a symbol of resilience. Digital archives make trial records and historical documents accessible to anyone with an internet connection, allowing students and enthusiasts to read her words as recorded nearly 600 years ago. Virtual reality experiences have even begun to recreate her battles and trial, offering immersive ways to understand her journey. These modern methods of storytelling ensure that Joan is not just remembered but re-experienced in living ways. What, then, explains her timeless appeal, even now in 2025? Part of the answer lies in the balance of fragility and strength within her story. She was young, untrained, and vulnerable, yet she changed the course of a kingdom. She was silenced brutally, yet her voice echoes more strongly today than those of her judges and executioners. People are drawn to paradoxes, and Joan embodies one of the greatest. That weakness can be stronger than power, that humility can shame the proud, that faith can outlast fire. Another part lies in her humanity. Despite the myths, Joan was not flawless. She could be stubborn, blunt, and unyielding to the point of alienating allies. She struggled with fear, admitted to doubts, and once recanted under unbearable pressure. Yet those flaws make her story more relatable, not less. She was not a statue carved in marble, but a living girl who faced impossible choices. In her humanity, modern audiences see themselves, and in her triumphs, they see what humanity can achieve. Finally, her appeal endures because her story is unfinished. Each generation revisits her with new questions, new interpretations, and new needs. She is not confined to the 15th century, but lives in dialogue with the present. Historians refine her biography, artists retell her drama, activists borrow her image, and believers invoke her intercession. She remains both specific and universal, rooted in her time, yet relevant in ours. In this way, Joan of Arc continues to live. Her ashes may have been scattered in the Seine, but her spirit has never been scattered. It gathers still, in the minds of scholars, the hearts of believers, the works of artists, and the struggles of those who seek courage in their own battles. Nearly 600 years after her death, she walks beside us, not as a ghost but as a presence, part memory, part myth, part saint, part soldier, wholly unforgettable. And as we stand in the year 2025, looking back at her life, we see not only a figure of medieval France, but a mirror of ourselves. We see the power of conviction in a world of doubt, the strength of youth in a world that often dismisses the young, the endurance of faith in a world of skepticism, and the fire of courage in a world that too often settles for fear. Joan's resonance lies not in the armor she wore or the battles she fought, but in the truth that even in the darkest times, a single voice, steadfast and unbroken, can still change the course of history.